Well, first, thanks so much for coming and signing up to come to this meeting tonight. This is our first time kind of doing something like this, particularly for this type of project. This is one of the first kind of community/science projects that we've done here at the Conservancy. We've done some bird surveying and some other things, but we started off our frog and toad exploits last year, and we're extending it this year, and are looking forward to getting some more people. So really appreciate all the turnout that we've got tonight, people that are interested in learning more about this. So as I get my slide going here, so just a little bit about agenda for tonight. So I'm going to give just a brief introduction, and then we've got a guest speaker, Andrew Badje, who's a conservation biologist from the Wisconsin DNR, and he's going to give a presentation about activities that are going on with frogs and toads in the state survey-wise. And then I'll come back on and I'll talk about the project that we did last year in 2021, starting the survey, and tons of information about what we're going to do this year, and hopefully answer a lot of questions that people might have. And then afterwards, we'll have a brief Q&A. So if you have questions, post them in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. We're hoping to go not much later than 7:30, and hopefully between the two presentations that we'll have plenty of time to get everybody's questions answered afterwards. So just briefly, Friends of Pheasant Branch, for those of you who aren't familiar, our mission, just to state it up front, is to restore, protect, and promote the Pheasant Branch Conservancy and watershed for today and tomorrow. And this drives our programs and decisions as we advocate for the Conservancy and do our physical, informational, and educational work. And this program tonight is really about creating more of those types of opportunities, educational opportunities, and just participation for people to get more engaged in the Conservancy, the place that they really enjoy, and just learn some things as they're going. And so, as I mentioned, last year was our first activity that we did with this. We had just a small group of people. Primarily, it was COVID was a factor, but we also wanted to kind of just get into the groove and figure out procedurally what we wanted to do, what was working, what wasn't, evaluating the sites that we were going to survey over the course of the season, just kind of see how that went. And so really this year is about expanding it out and getting some more help from hopefully a lot of you that are here joining us tonight. And really kind of the activities, you coming and volunteering, and if you're interested in becoming a member of the Friends of Pheasant Branch, that helps us establish these kind of programs and helps them grow and keep going, and hopefully add more in the future if we have success with this. And just to be clear, being a Pheasant Branch member is not a prerequisite for participating, but it's certainly encouraged if you want to go to our website and learn more about that opportunity.
Okay.
And just a quick note, as I heard somebody's volume, if you could mute, that would be appreciated. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew Badje, who I mentioned before, and he'll give his presentation, and then I'll be back seeing you after that.
Okay, just bear with me here while I get the presentation up, and then I'll just kind of try and walk through it in about 15-20 minutes, so you guys have some more time to talk through your program as well. But today, let's see here, hold on, let me just minimize some of these things and I'll get going. All right, can you guys see the full slide now?
Yep, we can see that now.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, I gave this talk actually at the Wisconsin Wetlands Conference a couple weeks ago, and so I figured this would be a great opportunity to not reinvent the wheel and give a shortened version talk to you guys. And so ultimately, just wanted to show everyone kind of what the DNR's Citizen Science Project, Wisconsin Frog and Toad Survey is all about, and kind of what we've done and some of the recent developments with it. And then probably afterwards, during the Q&A, we can kind of talk about how some of this may be kind of a good starting point for your the Conservancy and stuff to go off of and kind of further develop your projects going forward. So on that note, I just wanted to give a little bit of background, basically kind of why the program was our citizen science project was started. And so ultimately, in the 1960s and 70s, there were quite a few concerns about large-scale population declines and anecdotal declines of a couple of our species, the northern leopard frog, Blanchard's cricket frog, pickerel frogs, bullfrogs, and some of the other species. And at the time, we didn't really know what was going on. There was some things that we assumed were part of the issue, but as you can imagine, the really the conservation movement didn't even get started until the 70s, and so that we were really kind of behind the curve. But really, what we've noticing up in after that point is a lot of upland and wetland habitat loss and change throughout the states, really globally as well. Overexploitation in the research, food, and pet trades for a lot of our amphibians, especially bullfrogs and northern leopard frogs. Climate change was kind of a little, it wasn't really was an unknown back then. And so different changes in weather patterns, storm intensity, more severe flooding, and other things like that. In addition to contaminants in the environment, mercury, fertilizers, PCBs, pesticides, as well as emerging infectious diseases that we didn't know anything about, which include chytrid fungus, in addition to ranavirus, and a newer one that was found a couple of years ago in the state, Perkinsia. And so, anyways, a lot of those things were coming to fruition, and so the DNR, with the help of some of the professors at UW Stevens Point, really decided to try and do a better job monitoring our frog populations going forward through citizen science. And so in the early 90s, for a 3-year period, there was kind of a survey initiation and standardization to kind of do a better job tracking these through their breeding calls over the years. And then after those 3 years, then in 1984, that's when our project, which I'll talk to you guys a little bit more about, was fully initiated, and that's kind of when it went fully public. And again, that was 2 DNR employees at the time, Ruth Hine and Mike Mossman. Mike, who recently retired, some of you may know, in addition to Deborah Jansen and Ray Anderson at UW Stevens Point. And to date, that basically our Frog and Toad survey is the oldest and longest frog and toad calling survey in the nation. And it's also been a pretty big model for other states and kind of the national program to implement as well. So Wisconsin, in addition to our other conservation routes, we're kind of leading the charge with frog and toad conservation too. And again, this is predominantly through citizen science. And so you can kind of see in this map in the upper right, it's not particularly up to date, but this is kind of the distribution of all of our driving transect routes in the states. And so one of our later slides will show how many we have, but I think it's kind of in that 170 plus different routes throughout the state. So volunteers definitely do fill those routes, and they cover a lot of ground, and it's just something that really is a cost effective, and it's very helpful for DNR managers like myself in finding ways to analyze 12 different species of frog and toad in the state for their trends. And then our project too has also really served as a good opportunity just to serve as a sounding board for education and outreach, and just getting people to appreciate what frogs and toads contribute.
Frog and toad in books. Next, vaccines.
I'll be back in a while.
Political geography starts and ends with the same vowel, and then women make passes.
And so as of 2021, 123 of those routes were surveyed, and so that's 196 plus. Usually not all the volunteers put their names on data sheets, but we typically have anywhere from 200 to 300 volunteers every year helping out in these surveys, which is pretty cool to see. And really what this is, what these driving surveys are, I'll talk to you guys about our other program too. But the driving aspect is people visit each one of these 10 different sites. They listen for frogs for about 5 minutes at each site during a given survey, and then they can kind of record relative abundance and different species calling. And so if you did want to look for a route, you'd go to our website or reach out to me and see what kind of available routes are open in your area, review the materials, data sheets, survey manuals, route description and map. And then the big one, and I'm sure many of you already know a bunch of these just by the interest in the group, is learning the different calls. And so luckily, unlike birds, you only have to learn 12 different frog and toad species, which is pretty convenient. And of those two, there's only about 4 different species that sound kind of similar to each other. And so, once you get the hang of the easy ones, then it's just kind of refining the more difficult ones. And so right now we have a bunch of different options for learning the calls. One's through the Madison Audubon Society, where you can order MP3 audio tracks, and historically they had cassette tapes, and they might even still have some CDs for purchasing. That's a fun way to bring that home with you and listen to them that way. The U.S. Geological Survey has an online frog calling quiz, so you can search their website online, go directly to the Wisconsin section, and then learn the unique Wisconsin species, so you're not having to learn all of North America's different species. And then our Frog and Toad website on the DNR's website also has a bunch of different species videos where you can learn a little bit about basic biology, ecology, and breeding calls. And so part of the goal is making it very accessible for people to learn the calls, even if they just want to learn them for fun. So as far as learning some of as far as completing some of the surveys, again, this is for the driving transect, the driving route stuff. Usually we ask volunteers, they can go out 3 different survey nights per year. And so there's 3 different windows. One's in early spring, one's late spring, and then the last one's in summer. And so we just ask volunteers to go out one night within this whole window. So you can pick and choose which night's convenient to you. In this case, a 22-day window, and then 2 15-day windows. And so each time you go out, typically you're looking for certain species. So you're likely going to be listening and recording certain species, because not all species call at the same time every spring and summer. And so that's also part of the reason why we have 3 separate survey windows. And obviously we want volunteers to be going out after dark and during favorable weather. So warm, cloudy evenings with a little wind and high humidity are pretty ideal. In addition to, as far as going out to call, when you go out to each one of those, when you go out to survey a route in a night, you listen at all 10 of the different sites, and you basically just listen for 5 minutes. You're not involved in staying there for a super long time too. So you're consistently moving throughout the night. In addition to, some volunteers take water temperatures where they can access the water as well. A couple of other things. I don't actually think. Okay, yeah, I did include the data sheet, and I'll show you that real quick. But we asked volunteers to record all the frog calls on the data sheets. Any rare or unlikely frog occurrences, such as Blanchard's cricket frog, which doesn't really exist in the northern half of the state, and then mink frogs, which don't exist in the southern half of the state. We do ask on occasion to verify some of those calls. And during those calling time frames, we have 3 different call indexes to kind of gauge a relative abundance again. And so one is basically where individuals can be counted, and there's really not much, if any, overlap. A number 2 call index is if individuals, if there is some overlap, but you can still distinguish calls. And then 3 is basically what we call full frog chorus for that species, where calls are constant and overlapping, and it's really hard to count individuals. And so that and then 0 obviously means that the frog wasn't hurt at that site too. And so if we jump over to the data sheets, the nice thing about the data sheet is it's one page, front and back. The back is essentially the note side, and it kind of gives some information on how to figure out the call indexes, and how to figure out the weather parameters and stuff like that too. So it's pretty helpful that way. And then this bottom part here where all the data is essentially, this is where you record the frog species. And so this third section is for that first survey window, second survey window, and then third survey window. So it's all pretty conveniently packed into one data sheet, so you're not looking around a bunch of different pieces of paper and stuff too. And again, when you go out during each night, this would mean you surveyed one site and then you keep going down to 2, 3, all the way down to 10. So pretty convenient. And so that's how that traditional driving survey works. And more recently, we've actually been trying to get volunteers, especially in areas where driving surveys are at a minimum, or they're constantly get filled up every year, to help out with recording some of our frog phenology. And so basically that's a way for us to get a better idea of what's happening with climate change and how frogs and our one-toed species are actually modifying their calling behavior from year to year. And so over time, we can kind of look at that and see, when our average calling timeframe is starting up, are they happening later and later each year, and all that interesting things, and just looking at it from a bigger statistical level too. So and so actually we have had one volunteer who's basically been doing it since I think since 1981. And so getting data even from just that one site over I believe it's 41 years now is pretty impressive, and you can learn a lot even just from one site. So if you put a bunch of it together with volunteers throughout the state, it's pretty fun and interesting. And so anyways, those are the two surveys that we offer. And I understand too that your group might actually be kind of modifying your survey protocols to fit Pheasant Branch. However, I also believe you might be kind of utilizing a little bit of both of these surveys as well to fit your needs. And so here's just a quick look at what the phenology data sheet looks like. And so each one of these columns is a day. And so the goal is to go out as many days as you can throughout the calling season. And from here, you can kind of get a better idea of when frogs are starting to call, as well as when their kind of peak calling season is from year to year. And so, for example, this year, again, it's an example, and actually was probably using one of my Dane County dates back in the day, or one of my Dane County sites. In that year, which I believe is 2014, wood frogs started calling April 15th, and then by the end, they were done by April 30th. And so, again, even from one year in one site, you can learn a lot of really cool information, and kind of learn that wood frogs really do have a very condensed calling window compared to horse frogs, spring peepers, and other things too. So on that note, just kind of jumping over to a little bit more of the results and kind of the fun stuff, what we've learned from this project to date. And most of this results is actually looking at the driving survey, because that's what we tend to assess on an annual basis. Again, Wisconsin really set the drumbeat from 1984 up until 1997, which is when the USGS and more of the global community got involved with frog calling, especially in North America. And so we really were kind of setting the bar for about 13 years until they started. Other states and the North American programs got more involved. And then they used a substantial amount of our protocols in Wisconsin. And so we definitely had a significant role in setting those programs as well. Currently, we have 204 separate survey routes statewide. And throughout all those years, we've cataloged over 10,100 survey nights through volunteers. And that's, at least with the data submitted, that's contributed to over 99,000 different and separate unique site visits. And so, as you can tell, I mean, that's really a lot of time and effort that volunteers put in through this program over the years. And it's a lot of data that a lot of conservation managers would be really jealous to get their hands on. And over that time frame too, we learned a lot about the distribution of all of our different 12 species, whereas before a lot of it was just anecdotally, this is where people were finding them. And so we really learned a lot real fast on that end. And then from 1984 to 95, there was a really rigorous statistical trends analysis that we have on our website online that just kind of walked through that 11-year analysis of what's happening with each of the species over time. And so, again, a lot of really cool things we can do with it, and a lot of things we still can really do with the data too. So, and then on that note too, here's kind of a picture. So this is ultimately what we compile at the end of each year. So we have this graph, and so this solid line is ultimately the percent occurrence of species in the state, and the dotted line kind of assesses the abundance levels of where we're hearing them. And so I'll focus more on the solid lines just to not confuse you, but over that time frame, we can kind of see that mink frogs look to be declining throughout the years. It does look like they've kind of stabilized over the last 20 years. However, really from 1984 to about 2000, there definitely was a noticeable decline. Pretty similar to northern leopard frogs too, where that decline was really happening up until about the early 2000s, and then it's kind of stabilized. And so over time, we can kind of, figure out what kind of practices statewide changed roughly around 2000, and kind of see, why that's impacting frogs, and why their populations aren't declining further. And so, and then for some of the species that have been more stable, the boreal chorus frog, which tends to be found calling at about roughly about 50% of the wetlands monitored each year, and wood frogs are kind of in that 20, 30, 40% wetlands each year. And so there is a lot of variation between the years, but overall it tends to be pretty stable. And so that's good news for those more ephemeral based wetland species. And then some good news, probably the more notable increase has been the American bullfrog. And so kind of in the mid 50s to late 90s, that's really when the state has enacted better regulations for bullfrog harvest, just due to the frog leg food harvest and trade. And so as you can kind of see, that trend has really been going up year after year after year. And so that's been really, really exciting to see, a species that was commercially harvested and more heavily harvested back in the day, just seeing that increasing trend. And then not as severe, but starting to see spring peepers, which again are more of an ephemeral wetland species, seeing that the upland habitats aren't necessarily disappearing kind of on a wetland level and stuff like that too. And so even though we're monitoring frogs, we're also monitoring wetland health and distribution throughout the state too. So frogs are definitely more of an indicator for a lot of other things as well too that we can look at. So and then one other thing too, our only state endangered species, the Blanchard's cricket frog, one of our volunteers actually, which I'll jump into, actually helped find a new population in an area where they hadn't been seen since the mid 60s, and then kind of the early and late 1980s. And so depending on the county, I mean, some of this species hasn't been seen in 50 to 30 years. And so we have had volunteers monitoring those counties and those routes throughout the years. And so we're kind of starting to see a resurgence in those areas, and kind of an expansion from other nearby places like Winona, Minnesota, which has a resident cricket frog population there, which is where they probably expanded out from. And so again, the interesting thing was, the DNR, USGS, we did surveys in those areas 10 years ago. And then all of a sudden, even after those surveys, all of a sudden a volunteer reported these, and sure enough, DNR went back to target those areas, and sure enough, we found 9 separate calling populations. And so really, what I'd like to say is volunteers do an awesome job for this program, and really contribute a lot towards frog and toad conservation in the state, if not globally as well. So in summary, having this level of data is really cool, and is unmatched, and it's really essential for herpetologists and biologists, and using data sets like these to better monitor and conserve these species going forward, so we can make better scientific based decisions. And so on that note, I'll kind of end with my contact information. but I'll let Chris kind of take it away from here, and I can kind of help answer some questions if you need me throughout the rest of the talk.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Yeah, that was excellent, and I think that really bookends well with the stuff that I'm going to get into specific to ours, because really our survey is based around that phenology-based model, and I think a lot of the things that you talked about as far as the specifics on recording the data and the format of that is pulled directly from that, and so it'll seem really familiar. So I'm just going to share my presentation here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that, or now can see that. Yeah, so basically, kind of getting into some of the motivations that we had in terms of starting this program, and our land manager Rob Schubert, who I see is on the call tonight with Susan Gruber, who did a ton of surveying last year, basically thinking about kind of a broader picture of what's going on in the Conservancy. You know, there's been a real emphasis on plant management, but what about some of the other wildlife? And I think as we've gone into kind of from the restoration phase into more of the management phase, I think it's natural to start thinking about, okay, all the changes that we've made and the improvements that have happened, how is that affecting the populations in the Conservancy? And then at the same time, we've got this new 60-acre expansion north of the Conservancy, and that's a whole new frontier. And what is there? What is in that? What's populating that area, and what will populate that area? And so as we were going through the survey last year, I think part of this was kind of setting a baseline and trying to see how those populations are going to change, and gradually as we build those data points over the years in the future, that'll hopefully give us a better picture of some of the things that we're doing. And one of the other things too that's big about that change in the land is that less agricultural use. And so we have a number of the sites that we monitor are detention ponds that capture runoff water and things from that agricultural used area. And so as that water improves with the reduction of that ag use, you know, do we see those populations change as things improve? And generally just trying to build more opportunities for folks. I mean, we had so much fun doing the survey last year, and I think it's just an opportunity for more people to participate in programs at the Conservancy. And Hans Hilbert mentioned kind of at the beginning, maybe before some folks jumped on, but we just haven't had the last couple of years with COVID, we haven't had as much opportunity to give people chances to participate and volunteer at the Conservancy. And so this is another cool way, in addition to some of the work days and other things that we do, for people to be able to get out there and get a new view of the Conservancy. And so Andrew touched on this a little bit before about kind of the difficulty level of doing the monitoring and learning the calls and that sort of thing. And really all experience levels are welcome. I mean, so last year was my first time ever doing a survey, and I spent a lot of time on the USGS site and other DNR resources, et cetera, looking at and listening to calls. And you know, over the course of the season, you can get pretty comfortable with it because there, as Andrew said, there's not a ton of different species. And so there's, you know, the resources online to learn them. And because most of the calls sound different, it's not that hard to differentiate them. Unfortunately, we don't have necessarily huge populations. And so you're not necessarily trying to pick out 3 or 4 different species that are all calling at once. So you need to somehow be able to parse that out. Fortunately, it's just a handful, and it's relatively easy to do. And then just kind of a note on accessibility. We have 6 sites, and I'll go over those in a little bit, but we some are easier to get at than others. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to necessarily get their big boots on and get real dirty doing this, there's a lot of places that folks can go and more easily do a survey. And so don't be afraid about having to get too dirty in there doing the surveying. So last year, as I mentioned, we had just a smaller group, and it was really about kind of setting up what the format needed to be and setting that baseline for the data going forward. I think by having a smaller number of people doing the surveys, just a better, more I guess, consistent level of, what I see as an abundance code 2 is the same as, maybe Susan sees as a 2, et cetera, rather than if we had maybe 3 dozen people doing it and maybe everyone's interpretation was a little bit different. So that helps us kind of establish what our expectations are. Setting that scope. We did the survey from April 1st roughly until August 1st. A little bit before and a little bit after that, just based on how the days fell. We were doing it twice weekly through that mid-June timeframe, and then once after that, basically just capturing more frequency during the breeding seasons. And we did the 6 sites in the survey are in the Conservancy, and I'll bring up a map of that after this, and we'll go talk about those. But we basically did, as Andrew mentioned, kind of that typical protocol, kind of 5 minutes or a little bit more, depending on if you're waiting for things to settle down, et cetera, per site. And one of the things that we did, and I think we're kind of evaluating this, but we essentially, our process was only counting the calls that originated at each site. And so invariably you're monitoring, you're standing there for 10 minutes, and you might hear something that's south of the pond that you're surveying at. And we basically tried to just kind of from a data consistency standpoint, say, okay, what's just at this site? What's just at this specific monitoring site that you could tell? And then documenting the conditions. And so, again, as Andrew mentioned, getting some of those environmental factors like the air temp, water temp, wind speed, and then just kind of sky conditions as well. So here's a map of the area that we covered last year. So just to kind of orient people, the Pheasant Branch Road here on the left side, on the west side of the map, Orchid Heights Park down here on the, I don't think you can see my mouse cursor here. So, okay, so Orchid Heights Park down here on the right side, Pheasant Branch Road on the left side. So basically that expansion area that I mentioned before basically goes from this trail boundary up to Balzer Road. And so we wanted to have a good mix of sites from the existing Conservancy and the expansion. And so kind of just south of Balzer Road, we've got a detention pond that's up there. There's a couple, what we've dubbed the Prairie Lot and the Springs Lot. And so people who are familiar with the Conservancy, the Springs Lot is kind of the main county access to the Conservancy that most people will park at to walk and get into the trails and things. The Prairie Lot is the new lot for the expansion. So there's not really any trails or anything established yet, but there is a small gravel road that goes down to a culvert that's down there where the old farm was. And so there's a site there. Site 3, there's a berm with a culvert underneath that basically is just north of the old boundary between the existing Conservancy and the new expansion. And then a couple of detention ponds that are south of there that kind of run from the stream from there. One here, pretty close together. And that's basically just north of kind of the main trail that runs through the parking lot. And then the last site is at the Springs. And so just basically going out to the lookout point there and listening from that spot. We're kind of considering, depending on how much participation we have, maybe adding more sites for this year, but I think it's going to depend on how many people and how much availability people have. But 6 is a pretty good number, and we want to at least keep these spots to be able to compare and contrast to what we had in the previous season. So in total, we basically observed 6 species. You can see listed here. Chorus frog was kind of the most that we had. The rest of them were kind of pretty sparse. Tree frogs later in the year. We also heard spring peepers, but not specifically at the sites that we were monitoring. As I mentioned before, we just were counting at the sites specific to the call locations. Conditions wise, most things were dry from May onwards. If you remember, last year was extremely dry. Spring season, we had snow melt, and that created some opportunities, but then we just didn't really have much rain until June, July timeframe. So we really didn't have much. Most of the ponds that we were measuring at were dry, kind of getting beyond May. And so I think that limited our opportunities. But again, we don't know. We didn't have a baseline necessarily knowing what the populations were prior to that. So I think this year, assuming it's not going to be as terribly dry as it was last year, hopefully we'll hear more calls. But even despite that, we heard some calls even when things were dry late in the season. Places where there had been water, we still definitely monitored and noticed and heard calls from species even when those sites were completely dry. And we had some debate if we wanted to do surveying, even if those ponds and places were totally dry. But just from a consistency standpoint, we wanted to try to hit those data points throughout the season because we just didn't know. We don't have the experience. We hadn't had the population counts to be able to understand that. And kind of as I mentioned before, most of the calls that we had were in that early part of the season, not too surprisingly. And we did hear other calls nearby, and that kind of prompted us to think about, as I mentioned before, considering other sites that we might monitor. That's kind of a TBD at this point. And we also experienced some other wildlife out there. And so one of the things that we want to be careful of when we're doing surveying is allowing those other animals and that are using the Conservancy to not disturb them. And we had some places where there was a killdeer pair nesting at it was site 4, I think, which is one of the detention ponds, and we basically couldn't get close to that for a good bit of the season because they were calling, warning calls pretty severely as we would approach that site. So it's kind of monitoring some of those things and trying to have an understanding, but also respecting those populations as we're doing the surveying. So this year, 2022. So basically, as I mentioned several times now, our hope is to increase participation and get some more folks out here to be part of this program. And we're going to follow the same general format, same time frame, from spring until early August time frame. Again, once weekly through that part, or twice weekly through the first part, and then once weekly after that. And so we basically did one survey typically, and I think in the first part of the season we did Wednesdays and Saturdays, and I think we'll have some flexibility because we know not everyone is going to be able to do it on this specific night. So I think we'll have a range for the weekdays, maybe kind of a Tuesday to Thursday, and then on the weekends maybe a Saturday or Sunday, and we'll kind of figure that out depending on what people's availability is going to be. So I thought it'd be useful to kind of go through a typical night, and this will expand on some of the things or kind of go in parallel with some of the things that Andrew mentioned about kind of how that process works. But basically, before you go out, checking to see if how the weather's going to be, and if it's really rainy, if it's really windy, those are not good conditions to do the survey. Both in terms of hearing the populations and just being out there is not very much fun. So what we'll do, probably if the conditions are obviously going to be bad, I'll send out an email and let folks know that we're not necessarily going to survey that particular night if we have a specific night, but that's a judgment call that you can make as well, depending on your comfort and your observations. So departing for the Conservancy around sunset, and this is something that is obvious, but I don't think you necessarily notice it until later on. But obviously later in the year, it takes longer for the sun to set. And so, when you're taking calls and doing surveys in April and it's 7 o'clock and you're going out there and, oh, that's not too bad. But then when you're getting into July, it's getting to be 10 o'clock when you're out there. And so that's just something to be aware of, but basically going out after sunset. And typically I would depart about sunset and get there when it was getting fairly dark. And so sometimes last year we did surveying with partners. And so if you have a friend, or if you want to team up with some of the other folks that you're here at this event with, or thinking about surveying with, teaming up with somebody, meeting them there, or going solo and departing from there. So going to the site, but it's important to wait for things to settle down when you get there, because a lot of times you're going through the brush, you're making your way there, you're clunking things around, and everyone gets quiet. All the frogs and toads get quiet, and you might need to sit there for 5 minutes or 10 minutes until you might hear a call, and then one calls back, and you're kind of, the bravery sort of returns, and they start making calls again. And so you have to make sure you wait a little bit of time for those calls to resume. And then that 5 minutes, recording the calls that you heard and the time that you started that survey. And we've talked about this already too, obviously measuring the conditions. And kind of procedurally, everybody's going to kind of do this probably a little bit differently, but I found a good approach was basically going up to the site. You have your thermometer with you, taking the ambient temp at the site you're going to survey at, doing the survey itself, doing the 5 minutes and going through that process, and then maybe doing the water measurement after that, because you're going to create a lot of disturbance if you drop your probe into the pond or wherever you're measuring. So you could either throw it in the beginning and let it kind of set for that amount of time that you're doing the survey, or you can put it in at the end and make sure you're going to cause less of a disturbance. And then navigating to the next site, or if you're only doing one, or if you're on your last one, head home. And then sending data to our website that I know some of you have emailed me on already at survey@pheasantbranch.org. And we have so Janet Kane, who many of you are probably familiar with. She's a longtime contributor and volunteer with the Friends. And she's done a lot of work she did a lot of work with us last year with the survey, but has also done a lot with the bird surveys that we've done here at the Conservancy. And so she's going to help with some of the data recording. So you can send that survey data to that email address, and we'll both be able to get basically, it'll be kind of a small team of people that'll be monitoring that email address. But that's where you can send data and questions as well. So what kind of supplies are you going to have when you're going to want to be out there? So a headlamp is pretty important to have. You don't necessarily have to have that, but when you're recording your data on your data sheet or otherwise, having a headlamp is super useful. I found that I have a headlamp that has a red setting, and that's quite nice in terms of not overwhelming your eyes when you're kind of transitioning back and forth from recording data, looking at documents that you might have with you, and then going back to the surveying process. Notebook and pen. We're going to have a sample survey form that people can use. So last year, I actually made a booklet, and I just filled out as a graph paper booklet, and I filled it out with that type of thing, because that was the format that was useful for me. But some people, like Andrew demonstrated before, a set form, and so people could print those out or have that with them, and they can add the data right to that sheet. And a phone, either your phone or using a watch for a timer. Again, kind of thinking about light issues. So in the beginning of the season, I was using an iPhone to do the timing, but kind of transitioning from the bright light of the screen. I ended up I have like a Garmin GPS watch that just has a simple backlight. And I found that was actually quite a bit easier to use. Just be able to have it and have a free hand too, because it's on your wrist. You can kind of monitor the time more easily than having to kind of pull something else out. And maybe a camera or phone to record audio. And so if you're hearing calls and you want to kind of get home and hear those again and kind of review those, or if you want to ask somebody else, it's really useful to have a piece of equipment that you can use to do that with. And then the thermometer. And so, we've talked about that. And so we'll have a set of thermometers that the Friends are going to purchase for this process. And depending on, again, how many participants we have, we may have to share a little bit, but I'll get a number of those and we'll be able to distribute those for people to use. And what I used last year actually was a small bucket to keep the thermometer in for transporting it around, because you'll cast it off into a pond, and maybe the pond is kind of yucky because it's a runoff pond, and you don't want to necessarily be putting that thermometer back in your bag or in your pocket. If you have a little bucket with you on your belt, you can toss it in there, and that's pretty convenient way to do it. And then depending on the site, you may want to have some more serious footwear. And so earlier in the season, it's not too bad before things really grow up. But later in the season, things can get fairly wet, especially when you're kind of trudging through and some of the plants and things with moisture on the plants. It might be after a heavy rain, it might be you might get fairly wet. And so just kind of making sure that you're equipped to handle some of those wetter conditions. And then lastly, a phone for emergencies or for otherwise if you're coordinating with somebody. But you are going to be out there late. Chances are you might be out there alone. And if you're concerned, it's a good idea to have a phone with you just in case. Not to scare anybody. So an example data form. So this is pulled right from, this is what we had used last year. And this was pulled right from that Wisconsin Aquatics and Terrestrial Index resource. And so as Andrew had mentioned, basically, we'll have our date, we'll have the codes, and I'll talk about more about those codes in just a minute. We kind of went through those before, but then an abundance code for each of the potential species that we're going to see out there. And then probably some notes as well, depending on. So for example, you might hear, oh, I heard a tree frog south of the site where I was monitoring. not a bad idea to include that. And then we'll include that in the data record, and that kind of helps us understand, maybe changes we make to the survey in the future, or it's just interesting to see and know it. And again, some more information about those codes. As Andrew had mentioned, basically kind of a 1, 2, 3 call index. If you can hear an individual, it's a 1. If you can hear a mix of individuals, but it's not, maybe there's a little overlapping, but you can still distinguish between individual callers, that's a 2. If there's just a wild frog bonanza, that's probably going to be a 3. So that's definitely going to be a 3. And then some of the other things as far as kind of just assessing, wind speed and sky codes and things like that. We use these codes to try to make sure it's consistent amongst everyone's understanding of what the things are. And so you can use some of these descriptions of the wind to try to have a better understanding of kind of what that wind feels like, because you're probably not going to have something that you can measure when you're out there. And I think it's important I think it can be tempting sometimes to maybe look at your phone and say, well, what does the temperature say on the phone, or whatever the case might be. But there was quite a bit of variability in the wind conditions and even the sky conditions too, as we would go over the course of an evening from one site to the next. If you're out there for maybe an hour, conditions can change. So it's important to monitor and write those conditions down on kind of a per site basis. At least that's how we did it last year. And was kind of surprised at how much variability there was just kind of going from site to site. So some resources, and these are basically resources that Andrew mentioned as well. So the Wisconsin Aquatic and Terrestrial site that we've talked about a couple of times, the USGS frog quiz. That frog quiz is really cool, because they'll actually you can go through and you can practice some of the calls, but then they'll actually give you a sample mix that'll incorporate a few different calls kind of overlapping with one another, and then they'll ask you what you heard, and you get tested on that. And so that's a really useful way to get a better understanding. So that's kind of the rundown of what the survey looks like and how we're gonna go through that process this year. And so if you're interested and that sounds really fun to you, and of course it does, you're gonna want to email me at that survey@pheasantbranch.org address. And so we are specifically keeping a roll call, because I want to have an email list so I can email folks out, hey, here, we're going to meet this date for an introduction day, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and some of that other information. So kind of when you email me, there's a couple questions I'd like you to answer if you could. And kind of the first one is, what do you want to get out of this survey? And so certainly, we're interested in conducting this process and getting some data and finding out some interesting things about the frog and toad populations at Pheasant Branch. But what do you want to get out of this? What are some of the experiences that you want to have? And we want to figure out ways that we can tailor this program to be, interesting and enjoyable for you. And so, when you let me know if you'd like to participate, that's a great way to help us out. And then also your availability. And so, I think this is going to be kind of up in the air, and I'm sure some people are going to figure it out as they go, how much time they can spend. But if you have a general idea of if you want to do weekdays or if you want to do weekends, what part of the season do you want to monitor? Do you want to just do the first part? Do you want to do the latter part? What's your availability like? And kind of how much would you like to monitor? Do you expect that you're going to be out a few times? Would you like to try to do the whole season? That type of information can kind of help us assess if we need to get more help, or if we can add more sites, etc. So that's just really useful information. So the next steps here, basically, if you sign up before starting the season, we're going to have there's kind of two main things here. So first thing I'll send you an invitation we'll have a shared file online. We'll do either like a Google Drive or a Microsoft OneDrive, where we'll have some shared resources that people can get access to, including some of those links that I mentioned before, and Andrew mentioned about how you can learn and do some of the practice before you get out there. So some maps, so the map that I shared earlier, so you can have a better understanding of what those different sites are. And we'll actually be going over those in person at the start of the season too, so you don't necessarily have to look at the map and navigate your way to those sites just based on that. The data will be there, so if you want to see, what are my fellow surveyors seeing, and over the course of the season, there'll be a shared spreadsheet that people can go to and check out and kind of see in real time what that data is looking like. And then I'll also be sending out a link to a spreadsheet that we'll have. So in terms of the sign up specific process, what we're going to do is we're going to list all of the sites and then all the nights. And by nights, I mean, weeknight and then a weekend night per week that we're going to have available to do surveying. And to kind of just keep it simple, and we're going to see how this works, we're going to basically allow people to kind of self-sign up for those sites. So you could go in there and you could claim a date, you could claim a site and say, hey, I'm going to do site 2 this Wednesday, or I want to do all of these through all of March, or not rather March, but April or May or what have you. You can go through and do that, and we'll kind of see how that goes. And again, kind of as I mentioned before, there's opportunities for larger and smaller commitments. So if you're like, oh boy, I just kind of want to try it, or I think I can only do it a couple nights or a few nights in the season, that's okay. We're not necessarily, we don't really have any expectations about what people are going to be able to do and participate. And I'm sure that you're probably in the same position. And as summer gets busy, it can be more tricky. And so there's going to be definitely some flexibility for if you want to do a lot or if you want to just do a little bit. And then also this resource will be a place where people can upload files. And so I mentioned before about if you're doing a recording of some calls and you have a question on that, this will be a place where you can upload a sound file or a video file, and other people can listen to it and maybe get some feedback or get some input on what they think it might be. So what we're going to do basically to start the season, the first night, probably be late March or early April, we'll do a kind of a first night out or an introductory session. And so basically everyone's going to meet at once. We may do this over a couple nights. If we have a lot of people, we don't want to necessarily have dozens of people kind of tromping through all the different sites all at the same time. And so we may split this up into a couple different, maybe like one on a weeknight and one on a weekend, depending on people's availability. We'll have a waiver for people to sign. And so if you volunteered with the Friends before, doing seed collection or invasives management, that sort of thing, there'll be a form. If you've already done that will apply. You won't have to do that again. But if this is your first time doing a volunteer activity with the Friends, we do have a waiver to sign for that. So we'll basically go as a group to each of the 6 sites, and we'll run through kind of a sample protocol. Okay, I'm gonna measure the water temperature. I'm gonna check the wind speed. I'm gonna write these things down in my form and kind of go through that so people can get a lot of different reps as far as being comfortable with kind of what the format's going to be, and also figuring out kind of the best ways to get to some of those sites, because some of the things are off the trail and you're kind of cutting through different areas and that, and there are good ways to do that and there are not so good ways to do that, as you find, especially when it's dark, and so kind of navigating and finding your way. Want to give people an opportunity to get their hands on what that's going to look like, and obviously that night's going to be a great opportunity for questions too. And like I mentioned before, we may do a couple of these depending on if we have a ton of folks that want to participate. So that's basically what I've got, and now we'll kind of open it up for Q&A. I haven't really been following the time. Looks like it's about 7:30, but I think we can at least spend the 5-10 minutes answering some questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing. And we're going to go to the chat here. Hopefully there's been some questions that have come up if we haven't answered them. And I see, actually, I'm only seeing one question so far. And I'll read this out loud. And this question, yeah, okay. So actually, do you ever do any chemistries on the water, i.e. pH or oxygen level, especially on the newer agricultural land? So there is our water management committee at the watershed committee with the Friends. They do a water quality measurement, and that's been kind of part of again that process of transition between the existing Conservancy and the newly acquired land that was agriculturally used. And so we want to kind of monitor that on that level too, and so that's definitely something that's ongoing. We kind of had trouble doing that last year a little bit because we didn't have much water, but that's a process that's going to be ongoing for the next couple of years at least. So I see another, how accessible are the sites? Do you have to use any busy roads? Yeah, so the most of the sites you're going to be able to access just, you're going to maybe park at the Conservancy, or if you bike, it can be a little tricky with biking because obviously it's going to be dark, so you're going to want to be careful on the roads. But Pheasant Branch Road is not a busy road. One of the sites that's along Balzer Road is more or less a park, kind of a park along the side of the road, and so I wouldn't feel necessarily comfortable biking on that, but most of the other sites are. But most of them you can get to from the trail, or it's maybe a 5-minute kind of off trail adventure to be able to get to those. So I see Andrew's comment. He's seen green frogs using the retention ponds outside Orchid Heights. Yeah, that's cool. I didn't see or hear, well, not see, but hear any of the calls last year. But it would be interesting to see, and maybe just kind of tangentially going out there and checking out the stream over by Orchid Heights to see if we're getting any more activity in that species.
Yeah, I'm guessing too, it could just be that with the drought that you guys were kind of experiencing last year, they could just be using some of the deeper water that weren't necessarily on your wetlands that you're surveying.
That water is nicer over there too, I think, than what we were surveying, so that could have something to do with it.
Okay. And then one other thought too, because I know in the past people have always wondered why they don't hear wood frogs and spring peepers in the Madison area. And oddly enough, I know of one site. It's kind of in Middleton. It's down by that Oakwood retirement center. But normally, usually why there aren't a lot of spring peepers in some of the urban areas in the state are because a lot of the upland habitats have been developed over time, and so they need the ephemeral wetlands, but they also need the uplands where they overwinter. And so that's kind of that's kind of an interesting fact, that if you do eventually get wood frogs and spring peepers at your sites, that's a good sign that your uplands are either becoming more intact with more leaf litter and stuff like that, or you still have intact habitat. So, but at the same time too, it could just be that you may not have that much that good or high quality of ephemeral wetlands in the area, period, because Pheasant Branch is definitely more marshy to begin with, so they might not be attracted to the wetlands too because of that. But just some food for thought on what you might be hearing.
Yeah, we expected, I think, to hear some wood frogs last year, and we didn't, and that maybe helps explain that. But I think the spring peepers that we heard early in the season were in kind of the ditch that runs along Pheasant Branch Road, kind of between that and the farm that's across the street there. And so that was one of the sites that we were thinking about listening more carefully to this year to see if we could pick up some more populations from that spot.
Okay. And it looked like CP Brights was wondering if the slideshow will be available.
It will be.
If
sorry.
you want, I could turn it into a PDF and send it over to you, Chris. Just give me a reminder tomorrow, and I'll put it together, and then you can email it to the group.
So we are recording this as well. So I think we had talked about this the other day, but I think the hope is that we could share this presentation out if you're okay with that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll have that available, and I'll put up my presentation, I think, as a PDF as well, because it's just easier to digest some of that stuff when it's a document versus kind of cycling through a video. So any other questions?
We did just have the one comment about Middleton spring break. So as far as
Sure.
planning,
Yep.
we'll be sure to look at various calendars to try to schedule around things that may be conflicts as we look out the next month or so.
Yeah, so basically what I'll do, as I mentioned before, if you send me an email, you'll go on the email list, and we'll kind of survey, no pun intended, for what's going to be the best day to do some of those intro days, and that may be dependent upon that. If it ends up being a situation where we have to kind of do it maybe in early April, I think that would be okay. We'll just kind of see how it works out for most folks. And if we do need to do some, some refresher and some of that as the season goes on, I think we're going to probably have questions and people that want to have a little more help. We'll probably do some more of that later in the season, especially for people that maybe are kind of jumping on to the program a little bit later than others. So. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up from there. But I just want to say, you know, a special thank you to Andrew for joining us tonight and going through that presentation. I think it provides a lot of good context for what we're trying to accomplish here at the Conservancy, and you know what we're kind of contributing to on hopefully a larger scale as we go forward with this. So very much looking forward to hopefully meeting a lot of you folks in a few weeks here and doing some frog and toad surveying. So. And we'll wrap it up from there. And everyone have a great night. And again, give me an email if you have any questions in the meantime, or if you're interested in doing the survey. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.